On December 16, 2022, environmental pressures culminated in a fatal encounter inside a Midtown Manhattan women's homeless shelter. Victoria Good, a 27-year-old runway model, was stabbed to death after an argument with her roommate. Early coverage framed the incident as a noise-related dispute. Court testimony and witness accounts later clarified a more nuanced reality. The argument involved music and marijuana use inside a shared room, behaviors that irritated her roommate. Prosecutors were unequivocal in their assessment. Whatever the irritation, the response was senseless and grossly disproportionate. Good was living at the New Providence Women's Shelter, operated by Project Renewal, on East 45th Street in Midtown Manhattan. Like many residents, she was trying to regain stability while navigating the constraints of communal living. Friends and acquaintances described her as focused on rebuilding her life and pursuing modeling work. Shelter life, however, imposed strict limitations: shared rooms, limited privacy, and constant exposure to other residents' habits and stressors. In such an environment, conflicts rarely remain isolated. Her roommate, Charmaine Crossman, was in her early 40s. Prosecutors said the two women had been assigned to the same room for weeks. During that time, tensions grew steadily. Witnesses testified that Crossman became increasingly irritated by Good's behavior, including playing music and smoking marijuana in the shared space. These actions, while not criminal, became a recurring source of friction in a room where neither woman could step away for long. Importantly, court documents revealed that the conflict did not go unnoticed by the victim. Before the stabbing, Good had requested a room change, citing Crossman's behavior. That request demonstrated awareness and a desire to de-escalate. She sought separation rather than confrontation. The change, however, had not been implemented by the morning of December 16th, leaving the two women in a situation already strained and unresolved. That morning, another argument erupted. According to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, the immediate trigger was irritation over music and marijuana use. Words were exchanged inside the shared room. In an environment where stress levels are high and personal control is limited, the argument escalated rapidly. Prosecutors emphasized that this escalation did not occur in a vacuum. It followed weeks of unresolved tension, repeated irritation, and a lack of effective mediation. At some point during the confrontation, Good left the room and entered the hallway. Prosecutors suggested this may have been an attempt to disengage. Instead, the violence followed. Crossman armed herself with a knife and chased Good into the hallway, stabbing her multiple times. Other residents heard the disturbance and alerted staff. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the injuries were severe. Good was transported to Bellevue Hospital, where she was pronounced dead. She was 27 years old. Crossman fled the shelter after the attack but was arrested later that day. As investigators reconstructed the events, the district attorney's office was deliberate in how it framed the case. Prosecutors acknowledged the argument and the irritation that preceded it. They did not deny that communal living can produce friction. What they rejected outright was the notion that such friction could justify lethal violence. In court statements, the killing was repeatedly described as senseless, an extreme reaction to minor disputes common in shared housing. During the trial, this distinction became central. The defense highlighted the argument itself, pointing to annoyance over noise and marijuana use. The prosecution redirected attention to escalation and choice. Even if Good's actions that morning were irritating, prosecutors argued, the appropriate responses were ordinary ones: contacting shelter staff, requesting mediation, or walking away. Choosing to pursue and fatally stab another person reflected a catastrophic failure of restraint. Expert testimony reinforced that point. Mental health professionals explained how shelter environments can magnify emotional responses. Residents often live with chronic uncertainty about housing, safety, and the future. When combined with overcrowding and limited privacy, that uncertainty can lower tolerance for frustration. Small conflicts can feel overwhelming, but the experts were clear. Understanding those dynamics does not excuse violence. It explains how situations deteriorate when warning signs are missed and interventions do not occur. The shelter setting itself became part of the broader discussion. Women's shelters are designed to provide safety and temporary housing, not long-term conflict resolution. Staffing limitations and high demand can make it difficult to respond quickly to interpersonal disputes. Advocates later pointed to Good's request for a room change as a missed opportunity for prevention. That request showed she recognized the risk and sought help before the situation became dangerous. In 2025, Charmaine Crossman was convicted of second-degree murder in the Manhattan Supreme Court. She was sentenced to 23 years to life in prison. At sentencing, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office reiterated that the killing arose from minor communal living issues that should never have escalated. Officials emphasized that countless people experience similar irritations every day without resorting to violence. Before we advance to the second case, please take a moment to support my channel by liking this video and smashing the subscribe button. Thanks for the support. Attention now shifts to Case 2. A brief stop late at night turned deadly in a matter of seconds. Jordan Davis was 17 years old on November 23, 2012, when an ordinary moment after Thanksgiving ended his life in Jacksonville, Florida. He was riding with friends, sitting inside a parked SUV at a Gate Petroleum gas station, talking and playing music while they waited. It was public. It was routine, the kind of scene that happens thousands of times a day without consequence. Nearby, another car was parked. Inside were Michael Dunn and his fiancée. Nothing separated the two vehicles except space, sound, and perception. What followed would not be driven by a real threat, but by how one person chose to interpret what he believed he was hearing and seeing. The trigger was loud music, rap music playing from the teen's Dodge Durango. Michael Dunn later said the volume bothered him. He rolled down his window and asked for it to be turned down. Words were exchanged across the gap between the vehicles. No one stepped out. No one moved toward the other car. Yet in those brief seconds, the meaning of the interaction shifted inside Dunn's mind. What had been noise became disrespect. What had been teenagers sitting in a car became, to him, something hostile. Jordan Davis stayed in his seat. He did not approach Dunn's vehicle. He did not open the door. He did not advance. He was not armed. None of the teens were armed. That fact would later be confirmed repeatedly by police, prosecutors, and forensic evidence. Still, Dunn claimed he believed he saw a weapon first, describing it as a shotgun barrel, later as a lead pipe. That belief was not supported by evidence. No such object was found. No witness corroborated the claim. Even Dunn's own fiancée testified that he never mentioned seeing a weapon that night or the following day. In moments like these, fear does not wait for confirmation. It fills in gaps with assumption. Dunn interpreted posture, sound, and presence as danger. The belief hardened instantly, without verification, and was treated as fact. That decision would shape everything that followed. Michael Dunn fired 10 rounds into the SUV. The shots came rapidly. Forensic evidence later showed that he continued firing as the vehicle attempted to back away and flee. Inside the car, panic erupted. Screams filled the space. The driver hit the gas, trying to escape the gunfire. Jordan Davis was struck 3 times. Ballistics analysis showed he was leaning away from the shots, not toward them. The SUV sped away from the gas station. The teens were desperate to get help. Jordan was gravely injured. Despite their efforts, he would not survive. A teenager's life ended not because of an attack, but because ordinary behavior had been misread as intent to harm. Michael Dunn did not remain at the scene. He did not call the police. He did not call for medical assistance. He drove away. That night, he returned to his hotel, ordered pizza, walked his dog, and went to sleep. He would not contact authorities on his own. The gap between what he claimed to fear and how he behaved afterward would later become a critical point in the case. Police investigations quickly established the facts. No firearm was found in the teen's vehicle or anywhere nearby. No long weapon of any kind was recovered. Surveillance footage and witness testimony confirmed that Jordan Davis never exited the SUV. There was no physical movement toward Dunn's car. The threat Dunn claimed existed only in his interpretation of the moment. One detail surfaced during the investigation and trial that required careful examination. A small folding pocket knife, approximately 4 inches long, was found in Jordan Davis's pocket. It was never displayed, never brandished, and never referenced during the confrontation. Investigators concluded it played no role in the incident. Prosecutors emphasized that it had no bearing on Dunn's claimed fear, and courts later agreed it was irrelevant to the sequence of events. As the case moved toward trial, attention shifted from the sound of music to the psychology of the response. Prosecutors argued that Dunn had acted on assumption rather than evidence, fear rather than fact. The defense maintained that Dunn believed he was in danger, even though that belief was unsupported by physical proof, witness accounts, or his own statements immediately after the shooting. In February 2014, Michael Dunn stood trial. Jurors heard 2 versions of the same moment. One was rooted in fear and belief. The other was grounded in surveillance footage, ballistics, and testimony. The jury convicted Dunn on multiple counts related to firing into the vehicle and attempting to kill the other teens. However, they could not reach a unanimous verdict on the charge of first-degree murder for Jordan Davis's death. For Jordan's family, the partial verdict was devastating. The same misinterpretation that had ended Jordan's life seemed to linger within the legal process. Prosecutors announced they would retry the murder charge, citing the strength of the evidence and the clarity of the facts. Later that year, a second trial was held. This time, the jury reached a unanimous decision. Michael Dunn was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict aligned with what investigators had established from the start. Jordan Davis posed no threat. Moving on to the third case, an AR-15-style rifle was being fired repeatedly in the yard of a small home in Cleveland, Texas, late on the night of April 28, 2023. The shots came in steady bursts, loud enough to cross property lines and carry through closed doors. It was about 11:30 p.m., a point in the night when the surrounding streets had already settled. Inside a nearby house, a newborn baby had just fallen asleep. The gunfire continued. The rifle was in the possession of Francisco Oropeza, a 38-year-old man who, according to investigators, had been drinking while firing the weapon outside his home for hours. Neighbors later told authorities the noise was not brief or accidental. It lasted long enough to wake children and alarm adults inside nearby houses. What began as irritation shifted into concern that the gunfire might not stop without intervention. Next door lived a family that evening included several adults and children. The repeated shots startled the children awake. Adults inside the house tried to calm them, but the sound continued. The presence of a newborn raised the stakes. Sleep was not the only issue. The rifle fire carried the risk that stray rounds could cross into nearby homes. One man decided to address the situation directly. Wilson Garcia, who lived next door, walked to Oropeza's home. According to witness statements and police findings, Garcia did not confront him with threats or hostility. He made a straightforward request. Stop firing the rifle so late at night because a baby in the neighboring house was trying to sleep. There was no shouting and no physical confrontation. After speaking, Garcia turned back toward his home. The exchange ended at the doorway. What followed happened quickly. Investigators later confirmed that Oropeza went back inside his residence, retrieved the rifle, and followed Garcia toward the neighboring house. The distance between the two homes was short. The time between the request and the violence was brief. Gunfire erupted inside Garcia's home. Several adults and children were present, gathered earlier that evening. Oropeza opened fire at close range. 5 people were killed. Among them was a child, Daniel Enrique Lasso Guzman, who was 9 years old at the time. Early reports listed his age as 8, but his father later confirmed that Daniel was 9. The other victims were Sonia Argentina Guzman Taibot, 25, Daniel's mother, Diana Velázquez Alvarado, 21, Julissa Molina Rivera, 31, who was also identified in some records as Obdulia Molina Rivera, and Jose Jonathan Carceres, 18, whose surname appeared in some reports as Casares. All 5 victims were Honduran nationals who were living in the home at the time of the shooting. Inside the house, the adults reacted in an instant. Investigators later determined that 2 of the women, Diana Velázquez Alvarado and Julissa Molina Rivera, were found shielding surviving children with their bodies when officers entered the scene. Their actions prevented further loss of life. Several children survived because adults placed themselves between the gunfire and those children. When the shooting stopped, the damage was complete. 5 lives were gone inside a single home. The issue that began the encounter, late-night noise, no longer mattered. What remained was the aftermath. A family destroyed, survivors in shock, and a neighborhood struggling to process how a routine request could end in mass violence. Oropeza fled immediately after the shootings. By the time law enforcement arrived, he was no longer at the scene. Authorities launched a large-scale manhunt that involved more than 250 officers from local, state, and federal agencies. The search expanded beyond the immediate neighborhood. Helicopters were used to scan wooded areas. Tactical teams searched properties linked to relatives and associates. Schools in the area closed as a precaution, and residents were advised to stay indoors and report any sightings. For 4 days, the search continued. The sense of fear extended beyond the street where the killings occurred. The violence had not followed a long-running feud or a public confrontation. It followed a simple request for quiet late at night. That detail unsettled many residents, who struggled to find logic in what had happened. On May 2, 2023, the manhunt ended in Cut and Shoot, Texas, a community several miles away. Oropeza was located inside a relative's home, hiding in a closet beneath a pile of laundry. He was taken into custody without resistance. The immediate threat was over, but the impact of the crime remained. As investigators reviewed Oropeza's background, additional information became public. Authorities confirmed that he was in the United States illegally at the time of the shooting and had been deported multiple times in the past. Despite this history, he had obtained an AR-15 style rifle. These facts raised questions about enforcement and firearm access, but they did not offer a reason that explained the violence itself. The legal process moved forward in stages. Prosecutors charged Oropeza with capital murder, a charge that carried the possibility of the death penalty under Texas law. Court proceedings took time. Evidence was reviewed. Legal motions were filed. Families of the victims attended hearings and waited as the case progressed. The passage of time did not lessen the loss for those left behind. Throughout the proceedings, the focus remained on the 5 people who were killed and the circumstances that led to their deaths. Sonia Argentina Guzman Taibot was a young mother. Daniel Enrique Lasso Guzman was a child whose life ended inside his own home. Diana Velázquez Alvarado and Julissa Molina Rivera were adults who acted to protect children at the cost of their own lives. Jose Jonathan Carceres was 18 years old, just beginning adulthood. Each victim had been inside the house when the shooting began. Nearly 2 years after the killings, the case reached its conclusion. On January 29, 2025, Oropeza pleaded guilty to capital murder in San Jacinto County. As part of a plea agreement, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, to be served in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. As we explore deeper into these real crime stories, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate the support. Thank you. Case 4. David Graytock did not enter Lydia Morales' life as a figure of power. He entered it as a man who felt ignored, dismissed, and steadily stripped of control. By the time her life ended in 2023, the conflict between them was no longer about sound traveling through walls. It had become something deeper and more dangerous. A belief that confrontation was the only way left to be seen. What began as irritation hardened into grievance, and grievance, left unchecked, reshaped how he interpreted every interaction around him. Noise disputes often begin quietly. A television turned up too loud, footsteps late at night, music that carries farther than intended. In shared living spaces, these moments are common and usually fleeting. For most people, they end with a knock on the door, a brief complaint, or a call to building management. The problem may linger, but it rarely defines a person's identity. For Greytack, however, the irritation did not dissolve. According to court records and testimony presented at trial, repeated frustrations accumulated without relief. Each unresolved incident felt less like a minor inconvenience and more like proof that his concerns did not matter. Over time, the issue stopped being about noise and became about perceived disregard. That perception mattered. Feeling ignored can quietly corrode a person's sense of agency. The more Greytack believed that no one was listening, the more powerless he felt. Power, once perceived as lost, can become something people fixate on reclaiming. In this mindset, compromise feels like surrender, and patience feels like humiliation. Ordinary conflict resolution starts to look inadequate, even insulting. What remains is the idea that only direct action will restore balance. Lydia Morales was 44 years old in 2023. Public records and courtroom testimony described her as a resident who lived near Greytack, sharing proximity but not a relationship. They were not friends. They were not family. They did not share history beyond occupying nearby spaces. This kind of closeness without connection can be especially volatile. Walls and hallways force people into awareness of each other without offering the trust or empathy that often softens disagreement. In such settings, small grievances can feel inescapable, replayed daily without resolution. In the months leading up to the shooting, noise complaints became part of an ongoing tension. Testimony later suggested that Greytack felt unheard, not just by Morales, but by authorities and by the systems designed to mediate disputes. Each attempt that failed to produce the outcome he wanted reinforced the belief that normal channels were ineffective. This is a critical stage in the power reversal pattern. Institutions that exist to resolve conflict are no longer viewed as neutral helpers. They are seen as obstacles that protect others while denying the complainant relief. At this point, the conflict shifts internally. The noise itself becomes almost incidental. What replaces it are abstract but powerful ideas: dignity, respect, control. Prosecutors argued that Greytack's thinking evolved toward the belief that confrontation was no longer optional. It was necessary not to solve a practical problem, but to assert authority where he felt none existed. In this frame of mind, the other person is no longer a neighbor, but a symbol of everything that has gone wrong. Responsibility for frustration is externalized, concentrated on a single target. On the day Lydia Morales was killed in 2023, the situation crossed a final line. There was no evidence presented that the encounter involved an ongoing physical struggle. There was no indication that Morales was armed or posed a direct physical threat. What followed was not a chaotic fight driven by panic. It was a decisive act. In the logic of power reversal, it was the ultimate assertion of dominance, one that permanently and violently silenced the conflict. Greytack shot Morales, ending her life in an instant. In that moment, the idea of regaining control collapsed into irreversible reality. The act did not restore balance or dignity. It erased them. A human life was lost, and the consequences that followed were no longer subject to personal interpretation or grievance. When the case went to trial, the narrative shifted once more. Personal perception gave way to documented fact. Emotion yielded to evidence. In July, a jury found David Greytack guilty of murder. The verdict stripped away any remaining illusion that the act had reclaimed power. Control moved entirely out of his hands. Courtroom procedure replaced confrontation. Testimony replaced accusation. Accountability replaced resentment. On Friday, the Begar County District Attorney's Office announced Greytack's sentence: 30 years in prison. The sentence arrived without spectacle. There were no dramatic twists or revelations that changed the outcome. The law moved deliberately, guided by process, rather than impulse. In contrast to the suddenness of the crime, justice took place slowly and predictably. Moving on to the fifth case, in the early hours of September 17, 2022, the shoreline near Fort Sheridan Beach in Highland Park, Illinois, was active in a way that many lakefront communities recognize. Sound travels easily at night. Voices, laughter, and movement can carry far beyond their source, especially near open water. For most residents, these disturbances are temporary. For Michael Matt Ascaritis, they had become a source of mounting frustration. That night, Ascaritis did not immediately go to the beach. Emergency call records confirm that at approximately 12:54 a.m., he contacted both the Lake County Sheriff's Office and the Forest Preserve Police to report noise coming from the Fort Sheridan Beach area near his home. The calls were placed minutes apart, indicating persistence rather than impulsivity. Dispatch logs showed that a Forest Preserve police officer responded and drove through the area. According to the officer's report, no individuals actively causing a disturbance were observed at that time. With no clear violation visible, the officer cleared the call and left the scene. From an official standpoint, the issue appeared resolved. The response had been made. The area looked quiet. But for Ascaritis, the sense of intrusion remained. Shortly after the officer departed, he left his residence and walked toward the beach himself. Investigators believe he carried a flashlight. That decision marked a crucial turning point in the chain of events that followed. What began as a complaint about noise now became a direct, personal confrontation. At Fort Sheridan Beach were Jacob Firestone and Nicholas Cabin, both teenagers at the time. Prosecutors allege they were among those responsible for the earlier disturbance. When Ascaritis approached them, the interaction escalated quickly. According to charging documents and witness accounts, the exchange grew heated within moments. This is where the conflict shifted in meaning. The noise itself was no longer the central issue. Instead, it became symbolic. To Ascaritis, the continued activity on the beach represented a lack of respect for his home and personal boundaries, even after law enforcement had been contacted. To the young men on the beach, the confrontation may have felt like a challenge, public, accusatory, and personal. In situations like this, experts note that people often stop responding to the content of a complaint and start reacting to what they believe the complaint says about them. According to prosecutors, the confrontation turned physical. They allege that Ascaritis was beaten during the encounter and sustained injuries that ultimately proved fatal. Hours later, after the beach had gone quiet again, his body was discovered near the shoreline. The scene quickly shifted from a disturbance investigation to a homicide inquiry. However, the defense has presented a sharply different account, one that reframes the confrontation entirely. Defense attorneys argue that Ascaritis was the primary aggressor. According to their filings, Ascaritis allegedly struck Jacob Firestone in the head with a flashlight during the altercation. They contend that the blow was severe enough to cause a brain bleed, requiring Firestone to undergo emergency surgery. Medical records confirm that Firestone was hospitalized following the incident, lending factual support to the claim that he sustained serious injuries. From the defense perspective, the encounter was not a sudden, unprovoked assault on Ascaritis. Instead, they argue it was a chaotic physical struggle initiated by him. Any force used afterward, they claim, was defensive rather than intentional. These competing narratives, one portraying Ascaritis as a victim of excessive violence, the other depicting him as the instigator, form the core tension of the case. As investigators continued to reconstruct the timeline, additional evidence emerged that further complicated the picture. Firestone was initially charged with obstruction of justice, accused of attempting to hide a cell phone and a bloody wheelbarrow following the fight. Prosecutors argue that these actions suggest an effort to conceal evidence rather than immediately report what had occurred. Defense attorneys countered that the moments after the confrontation were marked by panic, shock, and confusion. They argue that poor decisions made in the aftermath should not be interpreted as proof of intent to kill. This dispute over post-incident behavior became another focal point in pretrial proceedings. In March 2023, several months after the incident, Firestone and Caban were formally charged with second-degree murder. The delay reflected the complexity of the investigation, conflicting witness accounts, disputed physical evidence, and the need to evaluate medical findings from both Escalated and Firestone. Prosecutors emphasized that regardless of who initiated the physical contact, the injuries sustained by Escalated were fatal and unjustified. The defense maintained that the evidence supported a claim of self-defense and raised questions about proportionality. Case 6 comes up next. Brooklyn, New York, October 29, 2023. Noise complaints in apartment buildings rarely explode in a single moment. They repeat. Sound travels through the floor. A neighbor reacts. The response brings no lasting resolution. Frustration grows. Another complaint follows. In this Brooklyn case, that pattern was not abstract or symbolic. City records, surveillance footage, lawsuits, and state investigative findings all confirm a cycle of unresolved conflict that escalated over time until it ended in multiple deaths. The upstairs apartment at Flatbush Gardens was home to Vladimir Mathurin, age 47, his wife Marie DeLille, and their family, including Mathurin's 27-year-old stepson Chinwai Mode. Mathurin was well known in the neighborhood. He was a local bodybuilder and worked as a school bus driver, a job that required discipline, early mornings, and daily interaction with families. Friends described him as routine-oriented, focused on work, fitness, and home life. Living in the apartment below was Jason Pass, also 47. According to city records, Pass had been filing noise complaints for more than a year before the shooting. These complaints were formal, documented through the city's reporting system, and repeatedly closed without a permanent fix. Each closure reset the process rather than ending it. This was the first escalation phase, unresolved administration. Noise was reported. Agencies responded. No lasting solution followed. The New York State Attorney General's Office of Special Investigation later confirmed that Flatbush Gardens management acknowledged the ongoing dispute and offered mediation. However, management also confirmed that mediation never actually took place. There was no completed session, no signed agreement, and no enforced separation. The loop remained active. A later lawsuit filed by DeLille added a critical layer of context. According to the family's legal filings, they repeatedly warned Flatbush Gardens management that Pass's behavior was escalating beyond complaints. The lawsuit alleges that Pass had become increasingly aggressive, including incidents where he kicked their apartment door late at night. The family claims these warnings were communicated to management, but did not result in meaningful intervention. From their perspective, the issue was no longer about sound. It was about safety. As months passed, resentment hardened on both sides. For Pass, investigators say the noise felt persistent and ignored. For the family upstairs, the complaints and confrontations felt invasive and threatening. Without mediation or enforcement, both sides were left interpreting the conflict on their own terms. Each new interaction carried emotional weight from the last. Surveillance footage, later reviewed by police, showed that the conflict had moved beyond paperwork and emails. Pass confronted members of the family inside the building on multiple occasions. These were direct encounters, raised voices, proximity. The dispute had shifted from administrative to personal. One of the most debated elements of the case emerged from this footage. During an earlier hallway confrontation, Mathurin can be seen holding a pair of scissors while arguing with Pass. Investigators have pointed to this video as evidence that the dispute had already escalated beyond words before the shooting. DeLille has disputed the interpretation, maintaining that her husband was not threatening anyone and that the family felt unsafe during repeated confrontations. This footage remains a central point of contention, illustrating how the same moment can be interpreted in sharply different ways. On October 29, 2023, the escalation reached its breaking point. Inside the apartment building, Pass again encountered Mathurin and Mode. According to police, Pass produced a firearm and shot both men. Mathurin was struck and collapsed inside the building. Mode was also shot and critically wounded. Emergency responders transported both victims to the hospital, but neither survived. The shooting transformed a long-running dispute into a double homicide. The sounds that once triggered complaints were replaced by sirens, investigators, and crime scene tape. Pass fled the scene, extending the escalation into a new phase. Detectives from the New York City Police Department reviewed surveillance footage, interviewed witnesses, and publicly identified Pass as the suspect. His image was circulated as authorities searched for him. The neighborhood waited, tense and uncertain, as days passed without an arrest. On November 1, 2023, police located Pass inside his vehicle in Brooklyn. Officers attempted to take him into custody. Early media reports varied on how long the encounter lasted, creating confusion in the public narrative. That uncertainty was later resolved. According to the New York State Attorney General's Office of Special Investigation, the standoff lasted more than 25 minutes. During that time, officers attempted to negotiate with Pass and bring the situation to a peaceful conclusion. The Attorney General's final report established this timeline after reviewing body-worn camera footage, radio transmissions, and forensic evidence. The report also clarified another key detail. Pass exited his vehicle holding a 6-inch knife. Forensic investigators confirmed the recovery of that knife at the scene. Authorities stated that Pass advanced toward officers despite commands to stop. Only after more than 25 minutes of attempted negotiation did officers discharge their weapons. Pass was pronounced dead at the scene. As required by law, the Attorney General's office conducted an independent investigation into the police shooting. The office confirmed that Pass was wanted for the October 29th double homicide at the time of his death and concluded that officers used force during what they described as an imminent threat. The report finalized the official timeline and addressed inconsistencies in early reporting. Case 7. A noise complaint rarely feels significant in the moment. It is usually dismissed as a minor irritation or an awkward exchange between neighbors. But in San Antonio, in December 2025, a single complaint became the starting point for a confrontation that escalated with alarming speed and ended in fatal gunfire. The dispute itself was ordinary. What followed was not. According to police, the shooting occurred in the early morning hours on a residential street on the city's north side. At approximately 5:15 a.m., officers responded to multiple calls reporting gunshots. When they arrived, they found Edward Trejo, 29, suffering from gunshot wounds. He was transported to a nearby hospital, where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The Bexar County Medical Examiner later ruled the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the neck, a finding that would become a critical factual element in the case. Investigators determined that the violence stemmed from a noise complaint linked to a gathering at Trejo's home. Friends later told police the event was a holiday celebration that had continued late into the night and into the early morning hours. While the gathering was social in nature, the noise carried into the surrounding neighborhood. At some point, a neighbor, Paul Flores, 40, went to Trejo's residence to complain about the noise. Police confirmed that Flores did not call law enforcement or file a formal complaint before confronting those at the home directly. What began as a verbal dispute escalated rapidly. Contrary to early assumptions that the argument remained verbal, investigators and multiple reports emphasized that the confrontation turned physical. Witness statements collected by police indicated that the disagreement spilled into the street and became a physical fight immediately preceding the shooting. Authorities have not released detailed blow-by-blow descriptions of the altercation, but they have confirmed that it was not limited to shouting or verbal threats. The physical nature of the confrontation marked a decisive escalation. Police have stated that neither party disengaged once the fight began. Instead, the encounter continued at close range, with emotions already heightened and no clear effort to separate or retreat. During or immediately after the physical struggle, gunfire erupted. Police confirmed that multiple shots were fired, striking Trejo. The shooting brought the confrontation to an abrupt end. The street fell silent. Flores remained at the scene and was taken into custody without resistance. Officers recovered a firearm and initiated a homicide investigation. One of the central questions in the case has been when Flores came into possession of the gun. Law enforcement has not publicly stated whether the weapon was drawn during the fight or whether Flores arrived already armed. This uncertainty became a focal point after Trejo's family began speaking publicly. Family members alleged that Flores arrived at the home carrying a gun, rather than retrieving it during the confrontation. Based on that belief, relatives stated that they felt Flores came to the residence with intent to hurt someone. These claims reflect the family's interpretation of events and their understanding of the evidence as presented to them. Authorities have acknowledged the allegation but have not confirmed it as fact, noting that questions of intent are matters for the court and will be evaluated through testimony, forensic evidence, and legal argument. Investigators have emphasized that there was no evidence of a long-running feud between the two men. Police said they found no record of months-long disputes, repeated threats, or prior violent encounters. Instead, they characterized the incident as a rapid escalation, triggered by a single confrontation over noise and intensified by a physical fight that quickly spiraled out of control. The impact of the killing was immediate. Vigils were held in Trejo's memory, and tributes appeared near his home. Friends and relatives described him as outgoing and deeply connected to those around him. Many expressed disbelief that such an ordinary disagreement ended in death, emphasizing that there had been no expectation of violence when the night began. Court records show that Flores was charged with murder and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. He was booked into the Bexar County Adult Detention Center, and bond was set at $200,000. Prosecutors have indicated that the charges reflect the outcome of the encounter rather than any established history between the men. As the case moves through the legal system, the focus will rest on the precise sequence of events: the escalation from verbal argument to physical fight, the role of the firearm, the medical examiner's findings, and whether the evidence supports the family's allegation that Flores arrived armed. Those determinations will be made in court. As the case moves through the court system, our focus turns to Case 8. The motive was noise, but the force behind the violence was accumulation. For Jose Ortiz, repeated complaints about sound inside his Bronx apartment building had become more than irritations. According to investigators and later court proceedings, they hardened into unresolved resentment. By the time violence erupted on January 6, 2023, the confrontation was no longer about a single disturbance. It was about every grievance Ortiz believed had been ignored, dismissed, or allowed to continue. Jose Ortiz, 65, lived in a multi-unit residential building in the High Bridge section of the Bronx, near University Avenue. Like many apartment buildings in New York City, the structure required close coexistence. Sound traveled easily through walls. Music, conversations, and movement were part of daily life. Residents told reporters and investigators that Ortiz frequently complained about noise in the building. Several neighbors alleged that his conduct went beyond ordinary complaints. They described repeated confrontations, tense hallway encounters, and an atmosphere of hostility centered on sound. Prosecutors later stressed that these accounts were allegations reported by neighbors, not independent findings, but they were cited to establish context. The importance was not whether each claim could be independently proven, but whether the pattern revealed escalating tension. Witnesses also told police that Ortiz had made threatening statements in the days leading up to the attack. According to those statements, Ortiz allegedly threatened to kill the victims the day before the stabbing. Prosecutors referenced these claims during court proceedings to argue that the January 6th confrontation was not isolated. At the same time, they acknowledged that the evidence did not meet the legal standard required to prove planning for a murder conviction. On the evening of January 6, 2023, the accumulated tension surfaced again. Ortiz confronted Vanessa Guzman, a 39-year-old resident of the building, about noise coming from her apartment. Police reports indicate that the argument escalated quickly. There was no evidence of a prolonged physical struggle before the violence began. Words gave way to action within moments. Ortiz produced a kitchen knife. Guzman was stabbed once in the torso. The wound was serious but not fatal. She survived after receiving medical treatment. At that moment, the dispute crossed from verbal confrontation into violent assault. What had begun as another argument over noise became a medical emergency. The violence did not stop there. A friend of Guzman's, Tyrone Quick, attempted to intervene. Quick was 45 years old, a detail later confirmed in Bronx District Attorney sentencing documents after early media reports initially listed him as younger. Police stated that Quick was not involved in the original argument. He stepped in to stop the attack and protect Guzman. Ortiz turned toward Quick and stabbed him 3 times in the torso. One of the wounds pierced Quick's heart. The attack was not a single impulsive motion. It involved repeated actions in rapid succession. Quick collapsed at the scene. Emergency responders transported him to Lincoln Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Ortiz was taken into custody at the scene without further incident. Police recovered the knife used in the attack. Investigators emphasized that the entire sequence occurred within minutes. Once the knife was introduced, there was no opportunity for de-escalation. In the immediate aftermath, detectives focused on reconstructing the timeline of the confrontation. Prosecutors widened that focus. The central question was not only how the stabbing occurred, but why it escalated to that point. Why did a dispute over noise result in multiple stab wounds and a fatal outcome? The answer, prosecutors argued, lay in accumulation rather than spontaneity. While the attack itself happened quickly, it emerged from repeated grievances that had never been resolved. Noise complaints that ended without satisfaction. Confrontations that increased resentment instead of resolving it. Over time, frustration hardened into hostility. Ortiz was initially charged with murder, attempted murder, manslaughter, assault, and criminal possession of a weapon. Prosecutors pursued those charges aggressively, citing the severity of the injuries, the number of stab wounds inflicted on Quick, and the fatal outcome. The sustained nature of the attack supported serious criminal liability. However, on October 21, 2025, Ortiz pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter. The plea reflected the prosecution's assessment that while the violence was intentional and extreme, it did not meet the legal standard required to prove premeditated murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The court accepted that the killing occurred during a confrontation fueled by escalating anger rather than advanced planning. The plea did not minimize the harm caused. First-degree manslaughter recognizes that a defendant intended to cause serious physical injury and caused death as a result. The distinction mattered not because the crime was less serious, but because criminal law requires precise standards when assigning responsibility. Case 9. In December 2014, just before Christmas, a routine morning walk to the train station ended in violence that would shock a community in northwest London and later draw national headlines. Alison Morrison, a 45-year-old woman described by friends and family as devoted and caring, left her home in Harrow as she did most days to travel to work. The walk was familiar, part of a daily rhythm shaped by years of routine and responsibility. It was early, the kind of winter morning when daylight is still thin and commuters move quietly toward their destinations. Morrison was thinking about work, about the day ahead, about ordinary concerns that carried no sense of danger. That sense of normality ended abruptly when her neighbor, Trevor Gibbon, ambushed her on the street. According to court evidence, Gibbon drew 2 knives from his car and attacked her from behind. The assault was sudden and overwhelming. Morrison was struck multiple times, the injuries severe and life-threatening. After the attack, Gibbon fled the scene, leaving Morrison collapsed on the pavement. Despite her injuries and her difficulty breathing, Morrison was able to speak. Neighbors who heard her cries rushed to help, and in those moments, she identified her attacker by name. Emergency services were called, but the wounds were too serious. Morrison died from her injuries later that same morning, her life ending only hours after she had left home expecting a normal day. The tragedy did not happen in isolation or without history. The roots of the violence stretched back several years, beginning soon after the Morrison family moved into their home next to Gibbons in 2011. What began as a neighborly disagreement over noise gradually grew into a prolonged and destructive conflict. Gibbon complained about the sound of the Morrisons' teenage son's skateboarding, a complaint that at first appeared minor and manageable. To the family, it seemed like the kind of disagreement that could be addressed through conversation or compromise. Instead, the complaint became persistent and consuming, dominating interactions between the households. As the dispute continued over 3 years, local reports and court testimony described escalating behavior that went far beyond simple complaints. Gibbon was reported to have repeatedly harassed the family in ways that intruded into their daily lives. These actions included banging dustbin lids early in the morning to disturb them, flashing car headlights into their windows at night, and creating confrontations in shared spaces. On at least one occasion, Morrison was trapped in her own car during an argument, unable to leave while Gibbon stood in her way. Each incident added to a growing sense of fear and unease, turning what should have been a place of safety into a source of constant stress. Morrison and her family tried to respond through formal channels rather than retaliation. They reported the harassment to both the police and local authorities, hoping that official intervention would bring the situation under control. They sought legal protections because the conflict was no longer an annoyance, but something that affected their sleep, their peace of mind, and their ability to live normally in their own home. The family followed the rules, documented incidents, and placed their trust in the systems designed to protect people from ongoing harassment. In a handwritten statement shown to jurors just days before her death, Morrison described the toll the situation had taken on her. She wrote about sleepless nights and constant anxiety, explaining that the behavior next door made it difficult for her to rest or feel secure. Most telling was her statement that she felt the situation would never end. Those words captured a sense of exhaustion and helplessness. The feeling of being trapped in a conflict that offered no clear resolution, despite repeated attempts to seek help. The dispute reached a legal turning point shortly before the fatal attack. On December 17, 2014, Gibbon appeared in court and pleaded guilty to a charge of harassment against the Morrison family. The magistrates imposed a restraining order forbidding him from contacting the family in any way. On paper, the order represented a clear boundary and a formal acknowledgement that the behavior had crossed a line. To the Morrisons, it may have offered hope that the situation would finally stop and that life could return to some form of normalcy. What followed showed how fragile that sense of resolution can be when anger remains unresolved. Less than 24 hours after the restraining order was issued, Gibbon made a decision that would permanently change several lives. Early in the morning of the 18th of December 2014, he took 2 kitchen knives, placed them in a bag, and drove to a location where he could watch Morrison's usual route to the station. This was not a chance encounter. He waited, observing, positioning himself where he knew she would pass. As Morrison walked by his vehicle, Gibbon got out, followed her, and attacked. According to the judge's remarks during sentencing, the first wounds were delivered to her back, indicating that she was taken by surprise. The attack continued even after she fell to the ground, a detail that showed the determination behind the act. It was not a brief confrontation or an impulsive outburst. It was sustained and deliberate, carried out with lethal intent. At trial, the defense argued that Gibbon was struggling with mental health issues and stress at the time of the killing. While those factors were considered, the jury ultimately rejected the claim that they diminished his responsibility. He was convicted of murder. Central to the jury's decision was the evidence of planning, the choice to arm himself, the decision to wait along Morrison's route, and the manner of the attack itself. These details pointed to intention rather than loss of control. The judge later described the murder as driven by resentment and long-held anger arising from the prolonged neighbor dispute, not by immediate fear or provocation. When sentencing Gibbon to life imprisonment with a minimum of 28 years before parole eligibility, the judge spoke about the devastating consequences of the crime. And now to the final case. Jamie Crosby lived in Thorpe Street, Andrew, a residential area near Norwich, where houses sit close together, and daily life unfolds in shared space. In streets like this, sound does not travel far before it becomes personal. Engines, doors, and voices spill easily from one home to the next. Over time, that closeness can turn irritation into fixation. In Crosby's case, it did exactly that. Dean Alsop was 41 years old. He lived nearby with his partner, Louise Newell, and their family. Neighbors later described him as a hands-on father and a familiar presence on the street. The dispute between the two men centered on recurring motorbike noise linked to Alsop's household. It was not a single disturbance, but a repeated irritation that Crosby could not escape. Each encounter reinforced his anger. Each sound renewed it. Proximity meant there was no cooling-off period, only constant exposure. This hostility had a documented and dangerous history. In 2018, Crosby was convicted of possessing a knife after chasing Dean Alsop with a saw and a knife during an argument that began over rubbish being placed in Crosby's bin. That incident marked a critical escalation. It showed that the dispute had already crossed from verbal confrontation into armed violence. Crosby received a suspended sentence and was placed under probation supervision. During the later murder trial, the court heard an even more troubling detail. While serving that suspended sentence, Crosby told his supervising probation officer that he wanted to kill Dean Alsop. This was not a passing comment made in anger. It was a direct threat reported to authorities years before the fatal attack. Despite this warning sign, both men continued living in proximity. The underlying conflict remained unresolved. By April 2021, the pressure that had been building for years reached a breaking point. On the evening of 14th April 2021, Crosby confronted Alsop outside their homes. The argument escalated quickly. What followed was not a brief scuffle, but a sustained and violent assault. As Crosby armed himself, Dean Alsop recognized the danger. Moments before he was killed, he was on the phone to emergency services, reporting that his neighbor was threatening him with a knife. That call captured the final seconds of Alsop's attempt to get help. Evidence presented in court showed that Crosby used 2 kitchen knives and a saw during the attack. Dean Alsop was stabbed repeatedly and collapsed at the scene. The violence did not stop with him. Louise Newell, Alsop's partner, rushed to help and was injured in the process. Another neighbor, Karen Cray, also tried to intervene. Cray suffered a severe arterial bleed to her neck while attempting to save Alsop, an injury that could easily have been fatal. Both women survived, but their injuries became part of the prosecution's case, demonstrating how the violence endangered everyone nearby. Emergency services arrived, but Dean Alsop could not be saved. He died at the scene, turning a residential street into a crime scene in minutes. Police arrested Jamie Crosby shortly afterward. During the arrest, body-worn camera footage recorded Crosby reacting to the news of Alsop's death. Instead of shock or remorse, he told officers, "That makes me happy. That's the best news I ever heard." The statement was later played to the jury and became a defining moment in the trial. The investigation focused heavily on the history between the two men. Prosecutors argued that this was not a spontaneous outburst or a fight that spiraled unexpectedly. It was the culmination of years of hostility, reinforced by proximity and marked by prior threats and weapon use. The 2018 conviction, the probation-era threats to kill Alsop, and the emergency call made moments before the murder all pointed to an escalating pattern rather than a sudden loss of control. At Norwich Crown Court, jurors heard detailed testimony about the prior knife incident, the threats made to probation, the weapons used in the fatal attack, and the injuries sustained by Louise Newell and Karen Cray. They also heard the emergency call Alsop made as he feared for his life. The defense raised issues relating to Crosby's mental health, but the jury rejected any reduction in responsibility. They found him guilty of murder. In September 2022, Jamie Crosby was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 28 years. In sentencing remarks, the judge described him as a very dangerous man. The court emphasized the sustained nature of the attack, the clear history of threats, and the lack of remorse shown after the killing. The sentence reflected not just the act itself, but the prolonged risk Crosby had posed to his neighbor. If you enjoyed watching this true crime video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. I've got more interesting videos coming up on the channel. Thanks for watching.